Welcome, everybody, to the next IITE seminar. So it is my great pleasure today to welcome Uli Brose. Uli Brose is based in IDIV in Germany, Integrated Biodiversity Center, and he's going to be talking to us about information flow through networks. So as someone who does networks with lots of energy and material flow, I'm actually very interested to hear what he has to say. So Uli, without further ado.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. I was asked to choose a topic that I would like to present, and there's certainly some topics that we could also talk about, but this is something that kind of like kept me busy thinking for roughly 10 years, or at least 7 or 8. And something that I'm currently starting to conceptualize a bit better, and that is that we have to think about that species or individuals in nature process information, which is driving their behavior and their movement. And this should be accounted for in models if you want to model the systems accurately. And it's not that easy, but it's good to get started. And fortunately, there's a bunch of people that I got interested in this. So we worked on this concept for a couple of years now, and including the ones on screen here that are partially in the working group, but also then collaborators from the field of behavior or movement ecology. So this is my idea to introduce you quickly to a bit of an esoteric topic. So I had this under review for a grant once, and one of the reviewers said, "This I kind of like the work on food, but this topic is very esoteric." So we'll see how it goes. And but it's the internet of nature. So I'm starting here from scratch. You can always tell me to speed up a bit or stop. But I thought we start with a food web. What is a food web? It's basically, in my eyes, a community description. So you have the populations of a community numbered, plus you have them organized and connected by their feeding links, so their trophic interactions. And then if they all have trophic interactions, then they're all connected into a rather complex system. So this is a small image of a meadow ecosystem. And there has been over the decades a lot of fantastic research on food webs. And I'll just pick some random examples here over the decades that I liked reading, and I always enjoy bringing up in seminars. So, for instance, there have been a lot of studies on the structure of these networks, that they are non-random. So the distribution of the links across the species is non-random. It follows certain rules. And one of the models predicting these rules based on the mass of the species, so that each individual in the population has a body mass, plus you have optimal foraging. A theory underlying this predicts the links, and then you have the so-called anometric diet breadth models, where you see here in the lower row predictions for some food webs in the columns, and the upper one the empirical links, and there's some consistency. So there, over the decades, has been a lot of interesting progress in understanding the rules that govern the links between the species and the structure. There's been also work on how this structure translates into different dynamics and process rates, for instance, and feedback cycles. So, for instance, this is the great paper by Samrat Pava on dimensionality, so that we have some interactions that are two-dimensional and other interactions that occur in a three-dimensional volume, and that this has implications for search rates and the time spent on search. So orientation in two-dimensional space is different to three-dimensional space, which feeds back into the structure and the dynamics of the food webs. And then the whole field will continue to explore more and more different questions, also applied questions. So food webs have actually, at least in my eyes, over the decades matured into a field that was not only concerned with itself and understanding the principles of food web, but also predicting things like, this is an example here, predicting stability signals like early warning signals for critical transitions here in these lake communities, where you could look at the distribution of the energy and biomass fluxes across the links. And other examples here. This was one where I was involved and was also trying to see how differences in these food webs, differences in the number of species, so the number of animal species here, the number of nodes increases from the left to the right, increases the biomass in the compartments, that's the size of the compartment, but also then the fluxes going upwards from plants, and this is indicative of certain ecosystem functions. So it's just some examples that food web research has really been spreading out into a lot of fields, predicting things, and just highlighting that it basically got involved in a lot of different discussions. So and all this basically gives always the impression that food web ecology is a predictive science and everything is great. So this would be probably a good presentation here. Just should have added some slides in between on what to talk about, the details of some of these studies, and we would all be fine. But yeah, I have to say I'm always bothered by some stuff that I find inaccurate, and well, I would certainly love to stop the talk here and talk more about these really nice projects that I always worshipped. I think that we have to make, in some respects, a full break here, because in a lot of perspectives, many of these approaches in predator-prey theory, functional responses, food web ecology, structural network models, in many ways you find implicit assumptions, and in many ways the assumption of random walks is included there. And it's just a visualization of a random walk here, so not necessarily related to the rest of the presentation here. So in many ways, for instance, in functional responses, it's intrinsically built on the rules of mass action laws, that the particles, like chemistry and physics use them, that the particles move by Brownian motion or randomly through space or through volumes. And this is actually not necessarily the case in biology. So if you think of a natural prey system, so for the presentation, I chose the example of deer and wolves, and you would say that by no means the wolves are randomly walking through Yellowstone Park. Instead, they continuously scan their environment and find cues, like the trails here of the deer as cues, as information, or sometimes also information that is sent as signals. So cues and signals actually comprise information, and this information is used by predators. But in many ways, the prey, of course, also use info cues and signals. So they use information of the predator and trying to avoid it, so they also don't follow a random walk. So in a way, this will have direct implications for many of the predator-prey interactions that we are modeling. So each predator-prey interaction where we have a link between a predator and a prey, it involves the trophic link. So that's the matter and energy flow that we typically talk about. So this is the biomass flux in between these two populations, but it also involves the flow of information here indicated in orange. So the functional response characterizing these interactions are a mixture of matter and energy flow and also information flow that is causing these non-directed movements. So this has been not much that I talk about today. It's been part of a PhD that's nearly completed by Jingyi Li. I think I've also seen her in the audience, and I think this is worth discussing with her, but I don't want to steal any of her results today. But then basically, information flow is also important here. And the first piece of this PhD has been published last year. This is an interaction model, a function response model that accounts for information flow and is thereby also able to include aspects of sensory pollution where you have background noise caused by humans that disturb these interactions. But today I grabbed the other part of this idea, and it is that if we go beyond those species that interact trophically, we also have interactions in terms of information exchange by species that do not feed on each other. So some examples here, I try to conceptualize them as far as possible by the typical trophic motifs that we're using in trophic ecology. So for instance, if you have two consumers of a shared resource, then this is an exploitative competition motif. And in that case, both consumers compete for the resource, but some of the consumers are typically very efficient at finding this resource, like the vultures here are very efficient, and other consumers of dead bodies or dead carcasses, you typically follow the signal of vultures, so they see where they go, and then they follow this signal. So they don't have a random walk. They exploit the information by the vulture flights and then come to the carcass too. There's a profit for the vultures too, but this is probably another part of the story. So this is an information link between two species that do not consume each other. In fact, they are in exploitative competition, but there's information flow in between them. And similarly, there's also other motifs. I see Bob Holt here in the audience, so I shouldn't talk too much about apparent competition motifs here. But if you have a consumer eating two different prey, so it's a generous consumer, these two prey are under apparent competition. But in many cases, I mean, for many of the trophic analysis we do, this is full stop. This is what we analyze. But in many cases, these prey also exchange information. So there's these heterospecific alarm calls or alarm calls of one species, and the signal is also picked up by the others. And this, in many cases, is warning across populations, across species, and shared information. So it's also a very common motif that basically has a very different structure and dynamic if you include the information flow. And another widespread trophic motif would be a food chain. It's a bit distorted here, but if you have a basis species like a plant, which has an herbivore, and this herbivore is attacked by either a predator or very commonly by a parasitoid. And you have a food chain of 3 species between these, and often, or the chemical ecology is full of examples that plants, if attacked by the caterpillar, herbivores are releasing volatiles, and these volatiles act as signals for the parasitoids to find their host, which is the herbivore. So again, here, this is a motif that involves 2 types of links. So trophic links, or the mixed trophic and information links, plus a pure information link that changes the efficiency with which the top predator finds the intermediate species of herbivore here. And then there is also quite a few interesting examples of information flow between more distant species, but I skip them for today. This is probably a full story and much less conceptualized than the other 3. But these ones can be easily embedded in food web analysis. So the take home of this part is that in general, if you believe me so far, if you go through the literature, chemical ecology, behavioral ecology, and so on, then this information flow between different species is quite ubiquitous. So it happens very often. It's very widespread. So there's many of these links. So you could take the same community that I used before, this conceptual meadow community. And instead of showing the trophic links of energy and matter flow, you could focus it on the information links. So some examples here. This is pure information links between species that do not feed on each other. In addition, there's in blue here another type of link. Many of these species also use signals or cues from abiotic sources, climatic or environmental, to change their behavior and movement. So this is another level of this analysis. So in fact, everything could be, if you go down this pathway, it could be very complicated if you want so, or very complex. So in the same community, we could describe this community either as a food web. So if we are in community ecology or food web ecology, this would be our typical approach to describe either structure or the dynamics or the functional dynamics of this community in terms of the food web. Or behavior ecologist or movement ecologist would probably rather go for the information type of description of the same community, but in fact they both happen or occur simultaneously. And this is why one of the visions I have is that we should go for the already mentioned multi-layer networks here. So thanks for bringing this in, the thing that has no German, correct German expression, but this is exactly what is here. This is a flattened multi-layer network where we have the same populations and they're either linked through matter and energy flow. So this is the trophic links, or they're linked by these information flows. Both occur at the same time, but the multi-layer approach now offers some opportunities for understanding these things at the same time and how they interact. This is the interesting part of it in my eyes. So I'm trying to get rid of this one. Okay. So that part talked just two layers of natural communities or two different network approaches. They can be merged. So there is probably not that I'm very skilled in this area, but there is skilled people who can efficiently do multi-layer approaches and identify these structures. So the last question probably is it really important, or is it just a topic that really drives only crazy over beer? And so I pulled together for this conceptual example, at least some description why I think it could be very important. So in this graphic here, if you look at the left column, this would be a regular food web. So just the trophic and matter flow links. And to the right side is the multi-layer network. So that comprises the trophic links in black and also the information links, so the pure information links between species that don't interact trophically in orange. And then you see right away from the first row that the network structures appear to be different. There's more links here. So in terms of network ecology, this is a very simple argument. If we want to understand network structure, this might be quite interesting. It also might have applied consequences. So not that we have fully studied them. I'm basically coming to you here with very early half-ripe ideas that could be published soon or coming up over the next years. At the same time, if you, for instance, look at the shortest path connecting pairs of species, you also, of course, see here is one example. This pair of species here, both in yellow, they're connected to three links in the purely trophic network in the food web. If we include the information flow going from the plant species to this parasitoid, then it's actually only two links. Of course, this is different types of links. So this is a flattened version of the multi-layer network. So you can account for different aspects, which we haven't done here. But at least the simple argument is clear that could lead to shorter connections. So in fact, species could be more coupled in these multi-layer networks accounting for information than in simple food webs. Disturbances might propagate more quickly. And the same then, of course, if you account for these additional links, if you look at the clustering here, these modules, then you see that this network has 4 modules in the food web approach. And if you apply the same uh, algorithm to the multi-layer network, which is, I think, at least partially wrong, but I hope you forgive me this because it's a flattened multi-layer, then you have um, only 3 modules. I started the discussion on how to do it with Shai Pilosov and Sonia Kefi, and then at some point we stopped and said, like, it's enough for the moment. I hope that everybody gets the point that the modules, how species are composed in clusters, changes if you account for these additional links. It's also not pure rocket science, but it's like it should show that this can have really consequences if we account for these information flow links. So that's probably bringing us close to the 7 p.m. beer. And that is already quite the take-home message. So I think what I try to show you is that there is evidence that information flow among species is very widespread. So it happens very often. Many species use information. So this is one argument why I actually started studying ecology, I realized. So that, I mean, I find physics and chemistry also very interesting, but somehow I've always felt inclined to also account for this behavior and information flow and movement of species, that these are actually living beings. Um, and with that, as they're driving, as information flow has consequences for behavior, movement, interactions, we could go further in the direction to account for this when we create models of communities. So many of the models that we often use are basically sharing most of their properties with models from chemistry and physics, which is not bad. It actually can learn a lot from these disciplines, but maybe this is an aspect where we can enrich the whole thinking about this type of modeling. And I think that I gave you some first ideas that it changes in our understanding of networks, probability dynamics. So it should probably also improve the prediction accuracy if we account for them. So it's a long shot, I know. So currently at the moment, we have no structure models how to distribute these links. We have started to get an idea how they modify trophic interactions, but we have barely an idea how the pure information links change behavior. So it's actually a synthesis. It's actually a long shot to talk more to behavior ecologists and movement ecologists about their models and understanding. So, but it's something I'm interested in, and as I was asked to present something I'm interested in, I thought this is probably a case, because I can also say if others feel this is interesting, this is definitely something I feel overwhelmed embarking in this direction alone. So it'd be great if others would love to collaborate here and keep thinking in this direction, because it's actually, I think this is a bigger directional change for many of the models we are using. It's would probably be helpful if people interested in multi-layer network analysis are also interested, because this is not my real house. And then also the empirical examples is probably not the right audience here, but I'm also collecting some food webs with empirical evidence of these links. So it's actually interesting meetings with empiricists and naturalists over these ideas. So that is the end. I think in theory, I was aiming for 6:30 to end, and this is one of the examples where theory has worked out. I made an accurate prediction, so I'm happy to end here. If there's question, great. And as I know that usually the best questions come up a day or 2 days later, please always feel free to send me an email. I'm very happy to discuss this also in the next days or weeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uli. Perfect timing, very good prediction. And if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand in the participant list, which I'm going to open now. And please ask. Yes, Bob, please go ahead.
Hi. Hi. That was really interesting, Dr. Brose. I have several thoughts. One is you're talking about information, but also there's misinformation in the world. There's mimicry, there's deception. That should be part of the web of the ecological network or whatever you called it, the Internet of Nature as well, that misinformation is rife in natural systems. That's
Yeah.
the first point. And then the second is what counts as information. I'm thinking back to a man I knew, Ross Keister, when I was a graduate student. Ended up in the National Forest Service, and so you all probably haven't heard of him, but he did some very interesting work on what he called cueing by conspecifics. He was working with Anolis lizards in Panama, and he did these selection experiments with juvenile lizards where he gave them a choice. They would climb up a dowel, and he gave them a choice between going to a bush to the left that had a lot of lizards in it and going to a bush to the right that had no lizards in it. Well, lizards are territorial, so you might think, well, they ought to go to the place that has no lizards. There's no competition. But he found they typically went to the place that had some lizards. And his idea was that there were a lot of things happening in the world that you can't see very well, such as the presence of snakes that come out at night and eat you if you're a lizard in the tropics. And that the presence of conspecifics all by itself carries a kind of statistical signal of what the environment is. The presence of individuals is an indicator that the environment is good enough to support a few individuals for a period of time. And I thought that was a really fascinating idea. And there's another thing that's illustrated by Russ's experiments, which was that information only matters if organisms have flexible behaviors and can make quote unquote decisions based upon the information, habitat selection, diet choice, phenology, so on and so forth. So those are just some quick thoughts, Ulrich, for you.
Yeah, thanks. Great thought. We basically talked, in fact, we talked about misinformation. Um, we just made a conceptual paper so far where it's just briefly mentioned. The idea was, but I'm not fully sure how to fully realize this mathematically, that information links could also be positive and negative. And
Mm-hmm.
it sounds a bit awkward, but positive information basically has a value for the receiver, and negative information actually has, how could you say this, is misvalue or has negative value for the receiver. I don't know how to express this correctly in English, but this was the idea. It's completely underdeveloped. Um, Conspecifics is right. This is an interesting topic. Uh, Often the aggregation also reduces the predation pressure or the per
Mm-hmm.
capita predation pressure. Um, so, but this is really something that I have to think about. So this is I like the idea of that living in an environment where not all information is perfectly available. So, but I have to think about honestly how to include this. But in many cases, this might be also quite important. So, thanks for the thoughts. So, to the second one, I think I have to do a bit more thorough thinking how
Yeah,
to do it.
thanks.
Thank you so much. Ellen, next, please.
Oh,
I
sorry.
have no idea of the order.
Did you call on me? Um, I'm Eleanor Lichtenberg, and I'm a behavioral and community ecologist. And on the behavior side, my research focuses on how bees use information from competitors to shape their foraging decisions. So I found this talk very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing your manuscript. And I have a question, but also to add on to the previous comment, add some more complication, we'll find that at least with bees that are learning about nectar availability, they sometimes switch their responses to the information depending on their experience in the recent environment too, just to keep things nice and complicated.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, when you're thinking about information, are you thinking about both personal and social information together, or are you focusing more on social information?
I have to admit that this was a bit fuzzy, but this is in the presentation, but this is partially because my thinking about it is a bit fuzzy. I realized this after reading a bit into the behavior ecology literature, that at some point I thought I had an idea what is written about. But then I realized what I'm interpreting was often in terms of between species, so across species communication. And many of the things that have been published without mentioning it explicitly enough for me was within a species, so individuals of the same species. And at that point, I wasn't fully sure if everything that is published there can be fully transferred to across species communication. And I have to. This is where I'm stuck. It's really not my field of expertise, and I enjoy reading it, but I'm not always sure if I'm interpreting it correctly. So any help or hint there? I'm actually.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that overall there's a lot less research on heterospecific social information use.
Mhm.
And which is what my research falls under. But so when I'm giving talks, I define personal information as directly sampling the environment to get information, whereas social information is observing others' interactions with the environment, whether those other individuals are other species or the same species. And there's a body of literature on like when individuals should use social versus personal information. But my suspicion is that for some ecological processes, maybe it doesn't matter because they're integrating all of the information, but I don't think we really have any research at that level yet. So that'll be really interesting to see as this sort of impacts of information on ecology moves forward.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I basically at the moment I approached it in a way that the understanding in terms of the physics of information transmission, the decay of the signal strengths and all these things, I took this as universal and just adopted it. With the receiver response to the information, I wasn't quite sure. So that receivers have basically different responses, and this is where I have to admit I'm a bit stuck at the moment and kept it very generic. But
Very
yeah,
interesting.
if that's interesting to you, I'm happy to come and approach you by emails if I have a problem and then ask you. So thanks for throwing that in.
Thank you so much. Robert, you are next.
Thank you, Dr. Brose. You talk a lot about information between species and so forth, but the network as a whole possesses information. You can take the network and you can do a calculation of how much mutual information is between it, how much conditional entropy. And the two are very different. The mutual information essentially is the structure building, which maintains the structure. The conditional entropy is essentially the flexibility that the system has to change itself in response to external perturbations. I remember about 60 years ago when I first met Bernard Patton. We at our first conversation, we were both interested in the topology of networks. And Bernie said, I think when it comes down to push comes to shove, that topology is more important than dynamics. That's heretical, of course, but it's something that I essentially devoted my life to trying to quantify. But one of the things two of the things, for example, that we can do. First of all, information theory itself is based on non-existence. Okay, you don't define information quantitatively directly. You do it by essentially negative interaction. So one of the shortcomings of physics is that it doesn't include those things that do not exist. Of course, ecology is rife with missing things, and they're very important to the whole dynamics. The second thing is to that much of the dynamics can be explained by the topology of the interactions. That a lot of the information we're talking about is essentially immanent in the actual flows that we observe, which are easier to quantify than the information itself. So anyway, I'll be happy to share with anyone, my list of publications on using information theory to quantify ecosystem topology and what it tells you about the dynamics. There's a lot that you can say about an ecosystem without getting into the dynamics. Well, thank you for a fine talk. Allah Achtung.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, in that perspective, I think one of the questions, at least that I think is open, is what part of information or so is actually usable by the species in the environment, and how much can they modify the information content. But yeah, I'd be happy to have a deeper read. Thanks.
I just said quickly, negative information, Dr. Holt mentioned this and so forth. Your mutual information for the whole system always has to be positive. That's a mathematical thing. But individual components, individual flows, it can be negative. And when it does, it usually is mutual exclusion. So, you know, it's an easy interpretation and a quantitative interpretation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Neo, please go ahead.
Hi,
Uli, it's so good to see you.
I cannot see you.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for the talk. And so a couple of comments. One is that you ask whether the information flows are important. For me, a fundamental issue is important for what? And what it comes to it is what I come to quickly is material consequences. You know, is there a material effect of this? And at the individual level, of course, hey man, I see a predator, a prey, you know, I go for it, or I see a predator, I run away. You know, obviously there's consequences. But I think in terms of the networks you're talking about, as so many things do, they go to the functional response. And so what I would think is that to decide whether something's important, you want to see a functional response that fails in some way, and that adding information considerations to it improves it. You know, that there is like you mentioned, that is there an improvement in prediction by adding information, or is it, no, if you can talk about search time or whatever. I mean, we have the density of the organism. We have, the presence of refuges, there's a lot of stuff obviously going on. But to me, to really demonstrate the utility of information, we want to see how it empirically, well, let's see, how it improves the theory to make it more predictive. Have you got there? Is that where you're at? Like, here's a data set that the functional response or some other thing kind of sucks, but when I add information, it like, oh my God, it does so much better.
No, I wouldn't say that anything sucks. It's just many of the things that have been published or done are done under specific conditions. And probably Jingy here would be a much better person to answer this, but she basically, in the model that she published that accounts for information flow in the functional responses, she showed many things, but one is that if you account for differences in information flow, then the functional response can automatically shift depending on information availability for the same predator and prey pair between type 2 and type 3. So the hyperbolic versus sigmoidal shape is actually a function of information availability. And thereby you can create this functions she created, fit them, and you don't have to predefine whether you fit a type 2 or type 3 functional response. You just fit this model and you basically get the most accurate description plus an estimate of the information flow. It doesn't mean that this is better than any of the prior models. It's just different. And now the conditions, I think the conditions under which most functional response experiments have been done, and I'm pretty much guilty of the same. We basically did a lot of them in the lab, is that we're trying to create ideal environments, small environments, high prey density, comparatively simple environments. So information availability is very high. And then we're trying to put them in an environment where there's not much disturbance. And then basically there's almost undisturbed information, and we're getting the results that we have currently. So the experiment that we're now envisioning to test these would be to replicate this functional response experience across disturbance gradients in terms of noise. This can be like acoustic noise, can also be light noise, or chemical noise in the air, and then see how this changes the feeding rates. So you basically have to get the environmental noise back into the lab to see it. And until those experiments haven't been done, I mean, of course, nobody so far would have done a functional response experiment by creating a very noisy environment, because it simply would create more scatter and thereby basically make the experiment more complicated. But we have to go back there and add the noise to the environment to see that then it actually is predictable what happens. But at the moment, I couldn't say that the new models fit better. They fit equally well. They just have some advantages that they explain the shift between type 2 and type 3 and have a mechanistic explanation. And then they basically also motivate the experiments that we now have to do.
See, to me, it strikes me, at least to systematize this idea of information, you have to go into the world of an organism's perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
A smell, a view, a feel. And so I don't know how you've split up. How organisms get information from each other is a big idea. To slice it into more chewable chunks. I imagine you've already done it, but in any case, you haven't not done it?
As I said, I came in with very early ideas.
Okay, got it. Well, good. Looking forward to what you do with it. Great seeing you, Julie.
Let's chat in 10 years.
Thank you so much. Eric, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. It was really interesting. And I've been curious with this idea about the connection between information flow and food webs, and the connection between how the stability of a food web is related to how predictable individual species dynamics are. So I'm really glad to see you digging into this.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a couple of quick questions. The first one is like, okay, the one place I can see where information flow has definitely been incorporated into food web theory would be like the ecology of fear, or the landscape of fear. Is that been included in? Is this being included in this, or do you see that as part of like a form of information flow affecting populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I see this as part. So I partially added it to the talk with deer and the wolves, but yeah, it's partially included in the concept. So it's one of the responses. So prey basically, as soon as they see cues of the predator, they respond by their spatial movement, aggregation. They go even to not so favorable subhabitats to avoid the predation pressure. And all these arrangements are part of it. They don't materialize necessarily in the food web links themselves, but only in a spatial version of it. And for instance, in the spatial version, if prey, by the ecology of fear, avoid the areas of high predator densities, the cues, it basically goes into the attack rate of the predator. They can actively, by this, reduce the attack rate or decrease the prey density as perceived by the predator, to be more precise.
Yeah.
So this is actually part of the concept. As many of the things before here, very bright ideas. So, but as many of the things, I cannot say this is fully realized. There's a fully fleshed out research paper just around the corner. So it's stuff we think about, but yeah.
So can I ask a quick, maybe another quick question on the dynamics side of things? In the sense, like, I'm a fisheries biologist. I switch between theory and applied a fair bit. And one thing we always run into is just like, if you're trying to predict fish from zooplankton, most of the time you can't do it. Like part of it, I think, is that in a food web at equilibrium, there should be very little predictive information of like several trophic levels away. So one thing I was wondering, have you thought about or dug into this idea about the possibility of like decay of usable information with food web links, in the sense that like if you're 8 trophic levels away from something else, the abundance of that thing should have no information for your fitness?
I haven't thought about it, but I like the idea, but I totally haven't thought about it. So happy to chat about it, but this is something that hasn't occurred to me yet. Yeah.
Well, great talk again. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Thanks so much, Eric. Itsuko, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. And I don't have any background in behavioral ecology or movement ecology, but I'm wondering about how you think about memory and then like how much ability for organisms to integrate information over time, and how also generation time or overlapping generations and so on. This kind of complication, I hesitated to more complex, more make the network more complex. But
I love it.
how would you think about incorporating these complications, or is it a necessary modification to be done to make a better prediction, to think about memory length and then how different species with different generation times and then capacities can have it, and then maybe like your another line of research like is allometric trophic network. So maybe you could also apply that kind of idea to say that bigger organisms tend to live longer and they could how can I say, remember information better and integrate more dimensions of information. What would you think about this complication to your very complicated, complex food webs? Thank you.
No, I mean, I have to admit, I love what you call complication, if it's basically bringing us closer to natural systems. So I love these challenges. So it's basically, thanks for bringing up the question. It reminds me that there was a question about bee behavior a bit earlier, and I just partially answered it. This is the question whether the response to information changes based on memory or experience. And I think certainly there's a lot of evidence that yes, I would probably first approach it without these effects, but it's I think of it similarly when we think of trophic links, that we can have them as stable links where the parameters of the functional response model describing these trophic links are constants through the time series of the model. But we can also switch them, that these links adapt. So we can make the links adaptive foragers. And when I thought about what you said, like we call it, I think, memory effects, I thought about it more as a long-term vision. It would be interesting to see if this adaptive information use, I think mathematically it could be very similar as an adaptive link, how to use information. So if you have exposed a lot and it was successful, we increase the response, would actually improve predictions. But for that, I personally felt it's such a long way to basically go into like looking at the functional models, what Neo mentioned, and see if including information improves their fit, then choosing community examples, predicting patterns at the community level and see if it improves the fit. And then as one of these steps, memory effects sound like super interesting to me, but this is a very strong bridge to behavior ecology, and I would like this, but I think for myself at least, this is a bit far in the future. So nothing I would realize in the first step to avoid making too many steps at the same time.
Would you think applying allometric theory could help guessing how maybe this play out?
Partially it does. Information use has also allometries, so in part. So Jingi, for instance, in her PhD also included some allometries on the, for instance, both the perception of information, but also the production of non-intentional cues is often has allometries. So larger species, for instance, if you think of visual cues or the vibration of the ground, it's basically stronger if you look at an elephant compared to a springtail. So there is some allometry in the production of these cues, and also the perception ranges or the acuity to these signals and cues often has an allometry. And so far I can say, yes, this is the plan. There's parallels to trophic networks or allometric trophic networks. Not everything will be the same. It's interesting. And I always have to admit, thanks for the great questions. Many of these are not exactly in my comfort zone, but this is, I think, part of the fun of adding stuff from the non-comfort zone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I guess I'm wondering a little bit I guess this information concept is to some extent a subset of the broader interaction modification approach to dealing with kind of how food webs adapt and respond to all the changes that are going on. I guess the question is how helpful do you think it is to subset off sort of information-driven modifications from other types of modification? And actually, is it even possible to draw that line? Does it end up that the more, I was thinking one example of like tall grass blocking visibility between a predator and a prey, sort of a classic interaction modification, but could be framed by information because the predator can no longer see the prey, it's not getting information of where it is. Do you think there's a boundary that can be drawn about what counts as information and what doesn't? Or is that not helpful?
This is very helpful. It's just very difficult to answer. Yeah, this is typically something I'd love to discuss over a beer or longer coffee, but this is probably out of the question for tonight. But yeah, I think this is the type of question where my gut feeling is it's easier, of course, easier to tackle this theoretically in a model where I would say information is things that have an effect. So basically species that are emitting signals or cues, if these signals or cues are not finding a receiver and the receiver is not responding, then it's probably not the type of information we're interested in. Whether it's still information is probably a bit of a philosophical question. This is why I said it's probably an over a beer type of question. But yeah, but in parallel, I'm also always thinking in parallel about empirical approaches, and there it's probably very difficult. It's probably just the movement and behavior modification that can be monitored. So we've set up a camera lab to monitor these things with automated image tracking. And maybe there is also information that doesn't cause any changes, and then we call this something else. But yeah, happy to keep discussing it. I have no idea, but it's a very good question.
Thank you very much for the questions. I will follow up a little bit on Chris's topic. Try not to be as philosophical. Try. So higher order interactions. Higher order interactions are often mediated by exactly the kind of information that you were talking about. And I'm thinking of classic experiments. Take Earl Werner's experiment with dragonfly nymphs, where you have an experimental pond, but you put a semi-permeable layer in between, and you only have the larvae on one side. The other side has tadpoles. The tadpoles are invulnerable because all the larvae are on the other side, and yet their behavior changes, and their feeding behavior in particular, just from the presence of the tadpoles. Or I think Andrew Beckerman has an experiment from way back then on gluing the mouths of spiders shut and observing that the grasshoppers start eating grass exactly to the extent as if the spiders didn't have their mouths shut. So that meaning the grazing drops by the exact same amount. Would this be a way to diffuse higher order interactions and reduce them into something pairwise? Or maybe a bit more neutrally phrased, is there a natural transformation where one can look at certain higher order interaction problems as if they were information network problems and vice versa? thought about.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the question I've been missing so far, higher order interactions. We've been shying away from this term to not open any big new boxes. I mean, if you focus on the trophic network on the food web, then many of the information interactions you could probably refer to as higher order interactions, because they're modifying an interaction the species is not directly involved in. So heterospecific alarm calls in apparent competition motifs or modules means that one prey species is using alarm call, which changes the strength of the interaction between the predator and another prey. So you could all call them all also higher order interactions. Jumping a bit into the literature, I felt that there are so many examples of higher order interactions that are very different. I wasn't sure how big the chunk of information flow is. So I kept the terminology a bit away from higher order interactions, but I think you're right in a way. Many of them actually of these information flow links, if you focus on the trophic links, are composing higher order interactions, or what we would call higher order interaction effects.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? If no, then thank you again so much, Uli, for the great talk, and thank you everyone for the great discussion. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. It's actually going to be Jacopo Grilli giving the next talk, so hope to see you all there. Until then, thank you again and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, and bye-bye.
Cheers.